It was just another regular Tuesday morning, the kind where most people wake up with their usual routines, grabbing coffee, checking emails, or rushing to catch a flight. For the woman at the center of this story, it started like any other work trip. She had been traveling back and forth between New York and Los Angeles for years now, balancing meetings, deadlines, and the constant grind of running her own company. Her name isn't important here, but what she stood for was about to become unforgettable. This woman wasn't just any traveler. She was the CEO of a tech startup that had grown from a tiny idea into a multi-million-dollar business. She worked hard, slept little, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've earned your place in the world. That morning, she walked through the airport terminal with purpose, her carry-on rolling smoothly. Behind her, dressed in a sharp blazer and tailored pants, she looked every bit the part of someone who belonged in first class, a section she frequented thanks to her loyalty to the airline. When she reached the gate, everything seemed normal. The boarding process went as expected. She handed over her ticket, flashed a polite smile at the agent, and made her way onto the plane. As she stepped inside, she scanned the cabin, locating her assigned seat in first class. It was a window seat, her favorite, offering a perfect view of the tarmac outside. She slid into the plush leather chair, adjusted her bag under the seat in front, and exhaled. This was her space, her moment of calm before another busy day. But calm is often short-lived when life decides to throw curveballs. Just as she settled in, pulling out her laptop to review some documents, something unexpected happened. A man approached her row, his expression tense. He glanced at his boarding pass, then at her, and said firmly, "Excuse me, I think you're in my seat." She blinked, caught off guard. "I don't think so," she replied politely, holding up her own ticket. Sure enough, it clearly showed her name and the seat number 1. There was no mistake. But instead of accepting this simple fact, the man grew more insistent. His tone hardened, and he gestured toward the flight attendant nearby. "Can someone explain this?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. The attendant hurried over, glancing nervously between the two passengers. At first, things seemed manageable. The woman calmly explained the situation again, showing her reservation details. The man did the same, though his manner remained confrontational. What should have been a quick resolution turned into something much bigger and uglier than anyone could have anticipated. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere shifted. Other passengers began to take notice, craning their necks to see what was happening. Some whispered to each other, while others pulled out their phones to record the exchange. The tension escalated when the flight attendant, perhaps feeling pressured or unsure how to handle the situation, suggested something shocking. Maybe the woman could move to economy class to make room for the man. The suggestion landed like a bomb. The woman stared at the attendant, disbelief written all over her face. Move to economy? After paying for a premium ticket? And why? Because a man claimed her seat, even though his claim was clearly wrong? It didn't add up. Yet there it was, hanging in the air like an accusation. "You want me to give up my seat?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Why?" The attendant hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "We just want to ensure everyone feels comfortable," came the vague response. That answer hit a nerve. Comfortable? Wasn't she entitled to comfort too? Hadn't she paid for it? More importantly, why was her identity who she was? How she looked suddenly being questioned in such a public and humiliating way. For the woman, this wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about respect, about fairness, about whether she truly belonged in spaces that society sometimes tried to tell her she didn't. She thought about all the times she'd faced similar moments in her life, not outright hostility, but subtle reminders that she was different, that she had to prove herself twice as hard to earn half the recognition. And now, here she was, on a plane full of strangers, being asked to step aside not because of logic or rules, but because of something unspoken, something rooted in bias and prejudice. Her mind raced, but her composure never wavered. She leaned forward slightly, making sure her voice carried just enough to be heard by those around her. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, her tone firm yet controlled. "I paid for this seat. I am not moving unless you can show me proof that I'm in the wrong." The words hung in the air, daring anyone to challenge them. For a brief moment, silence fell over the cabin. Then, slowly, murmurs began to spread among the passengers. Some nodded in agreement. Others shook their heads in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Whatever happened next, it was clear that this incident would leave a mark, not just on the woman, but on everyone watching. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was glued to the unfolding scene, and even the hum of the plane's engine seemed quieter, as if the aircraft itself was holding its breath. The woman sat firmly in her seat, her posture unwavering, while the flight attendant fumbled for a response. The man who had claimed her seat stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. For a moment, it felt like time froze. The flight attendant glanced at the boarding passes again, then back at the woman, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Ma'am," the attendant began hesitantly, "we're just trying to resolve this quickly so we can get everyone seated and prepare for takeoff." But the woman wasn't having it. She raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Resolve it? By asking me to give up my rightful seat? That's not resolving anything, that's avoiding the problem." Her words carried weight, and they landed with precision. Passengers around her started nodding, some murmuring under their breath. A few leaned forward, eager to hear what would happen next. The flight attendant, visibly flustered, turned to the man. "Sir, are you absolutely sure this is your seat?" she asked, hoping for clarity. He nodded emphatically, pointing at his boarding pass. "Yes, it says one right here." "I don't understand why this is so complicated." The woman let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "It's not complicated at all," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the cabin. "I have one, you do not. End of story." She held up her ticket once more, turning it slightly so others could see. Sure enough, the details were crystal clear. Her name, her seat assignment, no room for error. Yet, instead of backing down, the situation escalated further. The flight attendant, perhaps overwhelmed by the mounting pressure, made a decision that would change everything. "Ma'am," she said, her tone firmer now, almost apologetic but still insistent, "if you could please move to economy class temporarily, we can sort this out after takeoff." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Move to economy? Temporarily? It sounded reasonable on the surface, but the implication was loud and clear. Her presence in first class was causing too much trouble, and she needed to step aside not because she was wrong, but because someone else demanded it. The woman stared at the attendant, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to face the rest of the cabin. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, commanding attention. For a split second, the entire plane went silent. Even the man who had claimed her seat took a half step back, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Let me tell you something," she began, her voice steady but powerful, echoing through the quiet cabin. "I worked hard to build my business from the ground up. I've faced challenges most people couldn't imagine, and I've earned every single achievement in my life, including the right to sit in this seat. And now I'm being told to move not because of facts, but because of convenience. Because someone else thinks they deserve this spot more than I do." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged knowing glances. One older woman sitting nearby leaned over to her companion and whispered, "This is ridiculous." "She's completely right." The man who had caused the commotion opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, another passenger chimed in. "If her ticket says 1A, then she stays in 1A. Simple as that." Heads nodded in agreement. Someone else called out, "Yeah, why are we making this harder than it needs to be?" The flight attendant looked trapped, caught between conflicting demands. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit, where the pilots were likely oblivious to the pitchiness drama unfolding behind them. She pulled out her phone, presumably to call a supervisor or seek guidance, but the damage was already done. The situation had spiraled beyond control, and there was no easy way to reel it back in. Then, something extraordinary happened. As the woman continued to address the cabin, speaking not just to the staff but to everyone listening, a senior executive from the airline emerged from the front of the plane. He had been sitting in first class, quietly observing the chaos. No one knew his identity until he stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute. "Excuse me," he said, raising his hand to signal for silence. The cabin fell eerily quiet as all eyes turned to him. "I'd like to speak with the crew privately for a moment." He gestured for the flight attendants to join him near the galley, away from prying ears. What followed was a whirlwind of hushed voices and urgent gestures. The executive listened intently, occasionally shaking his head or jotting down notes on his phone. Whatever he heard or didn't hear seemed to confirm his worst fears. Less than a minute later, he returned to the cabin, his demeanor unchanged but his decision final. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, addressing the passengers directly, "please accept our sincerest apologies for the disruption. This matter will be resolved immediately." Before anyone could react, the flight attendants received simultaneous text messages on their devices. Their faces dropped as they read the messages, realizing what had just happened. Without explanation, they were instructed to gather their belongings and leave the aircraft. Within moments, the entire cabin crew was escorted off the plane, leaving stunned passengers in their wake. The woman stood there, frozen, processing what had just transpired. She hadn't expected this outcome, no one had. But as the reality sank in, she felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, sadness, and even guilt. Yes, justice had been served in some form, but at what cost? These employees, regardless of their actions, were human beings with families, dreams, and responsibilities. Had they deserved such swift punishment? As the replacement crew boarded and prepared the plane for departure, the atmosphere remained tense. Passengers whispered among themselves, replaying the events in their minds. Some praised the woman for standing her ground, while others questioned whether the airline's response was too extreme. But one thing was certain: this incident would not be forgotten anytime soon. When the plane finally took off, the woman gazed out the window, lost in thought. She knew her day had only begun, but already it had become a defining moment, not just for her, but for everyone involved. Little did she know, the ripple effects of those 60 seconds would reach far beyond the confines of the aircraft, sparking conversations that would echo across the world. By the time the plane touched down in Los Angeles, the story of what had happened on board was already spreading like wildfire. Passengers who had recorded snippets of the confrontation began uploading videos to social media, and within hours, hashtags like #FirstClassJustice and #StandForDignity were trending worldwide. The incident wasn't just a personal battle anymore, it had become a public spectacle, sparking outrage, debate, and calls for accountability. The woman at the center of it all stepped off the plane feeling a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved that the ordeal was over. On the other, she couldn't shake the heaviness of what had transpired. As she walked through the terminal, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers were reaching out to express their support or to ask for her side of the story. Reporters flooded her inbox with interview requests. Each email more urgent than the last. At first, she tried to ignore it all. She wanted nothing more than to get home, take off her shoes, and process everything that had happened. But as the hours passed, it became clear that this wasn't something she could simply walk away from. The world was watching, and people were demanding answers, not just about her experience, but about the larger issues it highlighted. That evening, as she sat on her couch scrolling through Twitter, she saw how deeply the incident had resonated with others. Thousands of people shared their own stories of discrimination while traveling, some subtle, others overt. A young mother recounted being asked to move seats because another passenger didn't want to sit next to her crying child. An elderly man described being treated rudely by airline staff when he requested assistance with his wheelchair. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of public anger. What struck her most, though, were the comments from fellow black travelers. Many expressed frustration at how often they faced similar situations, being questioned about their seat assignments, singled out for extra scrutiny, or outright dismissed when they tried to assert their rights. For them, this incident wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a pattern, a reflection of systemic biases that persisted despite efforts to address them. As the backlash intensified, the airline scrambled to respond. Their initial apology came quickly, posted on social media. Within hours of the flight landing, "We deeply regret the distress caused during today's journey," the statement read. "This behavior does not align with our values, and we are committed to ensuring such incidents never occur again." It sounded sincere enough, but critics weren't satisfied. They demanded action, not empty words. The next day, the airline announced a full investigation into the incident, promising transparency and accountability. They also revealed plans to overhaul their training programs, focusing specifically on diversity, equity, and inclusion. While these steps were welcomed by some, others argued that they didn't go far enough. Activists pointed out that firing the cabin crew, while dramatic, didn't address the root cause of the problem, the ingrained biases and power imbalances that allowed such situations to happen in the first place. Amid the chaos, the woman found herself thrust into the spotlight. Journalists camped outside her office, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or snag an exclusive interview. Her company's PR team urged her to stay silent, fearing that speaking out might harm her brand. But she knew she couldn't remain quiet, not when so many others were counting on her to use her platform for change. After much deliberation, she decided to break her silence. In a carefully worded Instagram post, she thanked everyone for their support and acknowledged the broader significance of her experience. "This wasn't just about me," she wrote. "It was about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong because of the color of their skin, their gender, or any other aspect of who they are. We deserve better, and it's time to hold institutions accountable." Her message resonated deeply, earning praise from activists, celebrities, and everyday people alike. One popular talk show host invited her to appear on their program, offering her a chance to share her story with millions of viewers. Another prominent figure suggested partnering with advocacy groups to push for policy changes in the travel industry. Suddenly, she wasn't just a CEO or a passenger. She was a symbol of resilience and justice. But fame came with its own challenges. Overnight, she became a target for online trolls and critics who accused her of exaggerating the situation or using it to gain attention. Some claimed the airline staff had been unfairly scapegoated. while others dismissed the incident as a minor inconvenience blown out of proportion. Reading these comments took a toll on her emotionally, reminding her of the harsh realities of living in the public eye. To cope, she leaned on her support system, her family, close friends, and trusted mentors. They reminded her of why she had chosen to speak up in the first place, not for recognition, but to shine a light on injustices that too often went unaddressed. With their encouragement, she began exploring ways to turn her experience into meaningful action. One idea stood out above the rest: creating a campaign to combat racial bias in the travel industry. She envisioned workshops, partnerships with airlines, and community forums where passengers could voice their concerns directly to decision-makers. The goal wasn't just to call out bad behavior, it was to create lasting change, one conversation at a time. As days turned into weeks, momentum grew around her initiative. Advocacy organizations reached out, eager to collaborate. Influencers amplified her message, encouraging their followers to join the movement. Even competitors in her industry praised her courage, acknowledging the importance of addressing systemic inequities. Through it all, she remained grounded, refusing to let the noise distract her from her mission. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change rarely came quickly or without resistance. But she also knew that moments like hers had the power to spark transformation if only people were willing to listen, learn, and act. And so, as the world continued to grapple with the fallout from that fateful flight, she prepared to step into a new role, not just as a leader in business, but as a champion for fairness and dignity. What started as a single act of defiance on an airplane had evolved into something far greater, a catalyst for conversations that needed to be had, and reforms that needed to happen. The journey was just beginning, and she was ready to see it through. The weeks following the incident were a whirlwind, but the woman at the heart of the story didn't let the chaos overwhelm her. Instead, she channeled her energy into something bigger than herself. Her campaign against racial bias in the travel industry quickly gained traction, drawing support from all corners of society. What started as a personal experience had transformed into a movement, one that resonated with people who had long felt unheard and unseen. Her first step was to partner with advocacy groups that specialized in addressing discrimination. Together, they hosted virtual town halls where passengers could share their stories. These sessions became safe spaces for people to open up about moments when they'd been treated unfairly while traveling. Some recounted being mistaken for flight attendants or cleaners simply because of their race. Others talked about being subjected to invasive security checks without cause. Each story added another layer to the larger narrative, painting a picture of systemic issues that couldn't be ignored. During one of these town halls, a middle-aged man shared his experience of being removed from a flight after speaking up about rude treatment by airline staff. His voice cracked as he described the humiliation of being escorted off the plane in front of other passengers. "It wasn't just about losing my seat," he said. "It was about being made to feel like I didn't matter." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For many, it was the first time they realized how widespread these experiences truly were. The woman listened intently to every story, nodding along and taking notes. She knew these accounts weren't just anecdotes, they were evidence of a broken system. And if she wanted to fix it, she needed data, not just passion. So, alongside the advocacy groups, she launched a survey aimed at collecting first-hand accounts of discriminatory behavior in airports and on flights. Within days, thousands of responses poured in from around the world. The findings painted a sobering picture. Nearly 70% of respondents reported experiencing some form of bias while traveling, whether based on race, gender, disability, or socioeconomic status. Armed with this information, she approached airlines directly, urging them to take responsibility for the role they played in perpetuating these injustices. At first, many companies were hesitant, fearing backlash or lawsuits. But she persisted, using her own experience as a case study to demonstrate the human cost of inaction. Slowly but surely, doors began to open. Executives agreed to meet with her, eager to understand how they could do better. One of the most impactful meetings took place at the headquarters of a major international airline. Sitting across from a group of senior leaders, she laid out her vision for change. "This isn't about blame," she said. "It's about progress. You have the power to set an example, to show the world that fairness and respect are non-negotiable values." She proposed several concrete steps: mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, clear protocols for handling disputes between passengers, and anonymous reporting systems where travelers could flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. To her surprise, the executives embraced her ideas, committing to implement them within 6 months. It was a small victory, but one that gave her hope. As word of her efforts spread, invitations began pouring in. She was asked to speak at conferences, appear on talk shows, and write opinion pieces for major publications. Each platform offered an opportunity to amplify her message, reaching audiences far beyond those directly affected by the issue. During one particularly memorable interview, the host asked her what kept her going despite the challenges. "It's simple," she replied. "I'm doing this for everyone who doesn't have a voice or who's afraid to use theirs. If my story can help even one person feel seen and heard, then it's worth it." Her candor struck a chord with viewers, sparking an outpouring of gratitude. Messages flooded in from people thanking her for standing up and refusing to back down. Many said her courage inspired them to confront their own battles, whether related to travel or other areas of life. One note stood out. A mother wrote to say her teenage daughter now felt empowered to challenge unfairness at school after hearing the woman's story. Reading those words brought tears to her eyes, reminding her of the ripple effect of standing firm in your truth. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Alongside the praise came criticism, some of it harsh and personal. Online trolls accused her of seeking fame or exploiting the incident for financial gain. Others dismissed her campaign as unnecessary, claiming racism was a thing of the past. At times, the negativity weighed heavily on her, making her question whether the fight was worth the toll it took on her mental health. On days like that, she turned to her support network, her family, friends, and mentors for strength. They reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place, not for recognition, but for justice. "You're planting seeds," one friend told her. "Not every seed will grow overnight, but the ones that do will change lives." With renewed determination, she pushed forward. One of her proudest achievements came when a coalition of airlines announced the launch of a new initiative called Fly with Dignity. Modeled after her campaign, the program focused on creating inclusive environments for all passengers. Airlines participating in the initiative committed to regular audits of their practices, transparent reporting of discrimination complaints, and partnerships with advocacy organizations to ensure accountability. The announcement marked a turning point not just for the travel industry, but for the broader conversation about equity and inclusion. Politicians praised the effort, calling it a step toward dismantling systemic biases. Civil rights groups hailed it as a model for other industries to follow. Even critics who had initially dismissed her work began to acknowledge its impact. For the woman, the success of Fly with Dignity was bittersweet. On one hand, she was proud of what she had accomplished. On the other, she knew the work was far from over. Bias wasn't something that could be eradicated overnight. It required constant vigilance and effort. Still, she allowed herself a moment of quiet celebration, reflecting on how far she had come since that fateful day on the plane. Looking ahead, She set her sights on expanding the campaign beyond airlines, hotels, rental car companies, and ride-sharing. Services all played a role in shaping travelers' experiences, and all had room for improvement. By broadening the scope of her efforts, she hoped to create a more equitable ecosystem for everyone. As she prepared for the next phase of her journey, she couldn't help but think about the passengers on that flight, the ones who had witnessed her stand her ground and cheered her on. Their support had given her strength when she needed it most, proving that collective action could drive real change. Together, they had shown the world that dignity wasn't a privilege, it was a right. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, she stepped into the future, ready to continue fighting for a world where no one would ever have to justify their right to belong. Months had passed since that unforgettable flight, and the woman at the center of it all found herself reflecting on how much had changed, not just in her life, but in the world around her. The movement she had sparked wasn't just a fleeting moment. It had grown into something far greater than she could have imagined. What started as a personal battle for dignity had become a collective push for fairness, respect, and accountability. One crisp morning, she stood at the entrance of an airport terminal, the same one where her journey had begun months earlier. This time, though, the atmosphere was different. As she walked through security and toward her gate, she noticed subtle changes, signs promoting inclusivity, staff wearing badges that read "Diversity Champions" and posters encouraging passengers to report any discriminatory behavior. It was clear that the airline industry was finally taking steps to address the issues she had fought so hard to expose. But this trip wasn't just another work commute, it was special. She had been invited by the very airline involved in her ordeal to speak at their annual diversity summit. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just months ago, they had publicly fired their staff over the incident, scrambling to save face. Now, they were asking her to help shape their future policies, acknowledging her role in pushing them toward meaningful reform. When she arrived at the conference hall, the energy was electric. Hundreds of people filled the room: airline executives, frontline employees, advocates, and even some passengers who had followed her story closely. Cameras flashed as she made her way to the stage, and applause erupted when she stepped behind the podium. For a moment, she paused, taking in the scene before her. This was more than a speech. It was a chance to remind everyone why this fight mattered and why it wasn't over yet. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I never expected to be here today, not because I didn't believe change was possible, but because I know how hard it is to challenge the status quo. When we talk about bias, prejudice, or discrimination, we're not talking about abstract concepts. We're talking about real people whose lives are shaped by the systems we create." She went on to share her story again, not because it was new, but because it was important. She spoke about the day she boarded that plane, expecting nothing more than a routine flight, only to find herself at the center of a situation that exposed deep-seated inequalities. She recounted the frustration of being asked to give up her seat, the anger of being treated differently because of her race, and the courage it took to stand her ground in front of strangers. "But let me be clear," she said, pausing for emphasis. "This isn't just my story. It's the story of millions of people who have faced similar injustices, not just in airports, but in schools, workplaces, and communities. My experience may have played out on a plane, but the lessons we can learn from it apply everywhere." Her words resonated deeply with the audience. Some nodded along, while others wiped away tears. A young flight attendant sitting near the front leaned forward, visibly moved. After the event, she approached the woman to thank her. "Your story made me realize how much power we have as individuals to make someone feel valued or invisible," she said. "It's changed the way I think about my job." That interaction stayed with the woman long after the summit ended. It reminded her that change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen, one conversation, one policy, one person at a time. Over the following months, she continued to travel, meeting with airlines, advocacy groups, and policymakers to keep the momentum going. Each meeting brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to push boundaries and break down barriers. One of her proudest achievements came when several major airlines adopted what became known as the Bias Hotline System, an anonymous reporting tool that allowed passengers to flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. The hotline quickly became a lifeline for travelers who might otherwise have suffered in silence. Within its first year, thousands of reports were filed, leading to investigations, disciplinary actions, and improved training programs. The impact extended beyond airlines, too. Hotels began offering cultural sensitivity workshops for their staff. Ride-sharing companies implemented stricter guidelines for drivers to ensure respectful treatment of all passengers. Even airports revamped their customer service protocols, emphasizing empathy and inclusion. Slowly but surely, the travel industry was transforming, and it was doing so because people refused to stay silent. For the woman, the journey wasn't without sacrifices. Her schedule was grueling, often leaving little time for rest or relaxation. Critics still tried to undermine her efforts, accusing her of being too ambitious or unrealistic. But she remained steadfast, drawing strength from the countless stories of gratitude she received along the way. One letter, in particular, stood out. A grandmother wrote to say her granddaughter no longer feared flying after learning about the Fly with Dignity initiative. "You've given her hope," the grandmother wrote, "and for that I'll always be grateful." As the years went by, the woman's legacy grew. She became a household name, not just as a CEO or advocate, but as a symbol of resilience and determination. Schools began teaching her story in classrooms, using it as an example of how ordinary people can spark extraordinary change. Documentaries and books chronicled her journey, ensuring that future generations would remember the woman who turned a single act of defiance into a global movement. Yet, despite all the accolades, she remained humble. In interviews, she often redirected praise to the communities and organizations that had supported her. "I didn't do this alone," she would say. "None of us can." Real change happens when we come together, listen to each other, and commit to doing better. On the anniversary of that fateful flight, she returned to the same airport once more. This time, she wasn't traveling for work. Instead, she wandered through the terminal, observing the subtle shifts that had taken place. Families moved freely, unburdened by the weight of judgment. Employees greeted passengers with genuine smiles, treating them as equals rather than statistics. It was a small victory, perhaps, but one that filled her with pride. As she stood by the window, watching planes take off into the horizon, she thought about the road ahead. There was still work to be done. Inequality hadn't disappeared, and vigilance was key. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Hopeful that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles she had. Hopeful that the world was moving closer to a place where everyone could exist without fear of prejudice. And hopeful that her story, along with countless others, would continue to inspire people to demand better for themselves and for those around them. In the end, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about proving that dignity wasn't negotiable, that belonging wasn't conditional, and that every voice mattered. As she walked away from the terminal, ready to board another flight, she knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over, but neither was she.